Hey guys, Steve here at SKS Props, and today we're going to make a Warhammer 40K Ork Choppa. Welcome to the shop. If you're new to the channel, be sure to hit that subscribe button because we're coming back with lots more tips and tricks for prop and costume fabrication. In today's build, we're going to be fabricating a Warhammer 40K Ork Choppa. Now this is going to be made all entirely out of my HD foam from Blick Art Materials, and I'll of course have links down below to that. Now this is going to be a two-part series. Part 1 is going to be a fabrication video. Part 2 is going to go over painting and finishing techniques. Because this is an entirely foam fabricated weapon, it is going to be both lightweight and, more importantly, con safe. We've got a lot to do to put this together, so let's go ahead and get started. Of course, the first thing to do is download and cut out the blueprints that I had made. You can find a link for these over in the description section. The main core of this weapon will be a cardboard tube. This should help with the rigidity but still keep the weight down. You could of course use a PVC pipe. I like to make multiple marks on my template before I cut them apart, that way I can line them up without having to guess later on. I'm going to start by fabricating the handguard, and I'm going to do this by transferring my templates onto some 10mm HD foam using a pencil. Once I have a rough cut using my utility knife, I take that piece over to my bandsaw and refine it to match the template. Once I've determined it's exactly the right shape and size that I need, I go ahead and I transfer that onto some additional sheets of 10mm foam. What I want this to do is look as though I'm going to be banding multiple pieces of metal together, so I'm going to need 6 of these in total. Now of course you could always cut these out by hand using a utility knife, but I have a bandsaw which allows me to move very quickly through multiple pieces. Putting on my respirator and eye protection, I take all the pieces over to my sanding station and I use the Dremel to knock down the edges to give it a hammered metal look. Switching over to a very smooth sanding drum at the highest RPM allows me to get rid of some of the impressions that were left by the medium grit drum while continuing to round over the edges. So I've got all 6 of my pieces smoothed out, ready to go, and I'm going to glue them together using some basic super glue. You could use hot glue or contact cement. I just feel that super glue works really well with my foam for details like this. I found a Forstner bit that was approximately the same size as the tube, that way I could drill through the handguard for the handle. The tube was also then tacked into place using super glue. Using the drill again, I go through another piece of 10mm HD foam, and this is going to act as the plate at the top of the handguard. This is cleaned up with the rotary tool and then glued into place. I transfer the main body template onto some 10mm HD foam. This is rough cut using a utility knife, and after I check that it's pretty close to the size that I want, I then clean it up on the bandsaw just like the handguard. Once this piece has been cut out, it is used as the template for the other side of the weapon, and I can figure out the spacing that I need for the top. In this case, I'm using a 1-inch strip of 10mm HD foam. Then I make sure everything fits properly and matches the template before I use a pencil to mark where the pieces need to be glued. Super glue is applied to the cardboard tube and slid into place. The base structure for this weapon is really starting to take shape. Measuring both sides and the top of the weapon allows me to figure out the amount of foam that I'm going to need to wrap around it. In this case, I'm going to be using 6mm HD foam, and I think I've got the perfect size figured out. Once I've got it lined up where I think it should be, I go ahead and I mark that position on the foam with a pencil, and because this is a larger area, I'm going to go ahead and use contact cement. There's nothing fancy about this step. I'm actually using a piece of foam as my applicator. The big thing is when you're using contact cement, you want to make sure to put it on very thin. Using the edge of my workbench as a guide, it allows me to make sure that everything is lined up just right, and I use the entire surface to make sure that the contact cement all adheres properly. Just a little bit of super glue is added to the end of the weapon. I want this to look as though the metal is being folded over upon itself. Going back to my template, I start cutting out all the pieces that will make up the additional layers on the weapon. The side pieces were transferred onto some 10mm HD foam and then super glued into place. Just like the 6mm foam, this 10mm foam has to be measured out so that it wraps around the top of the weapon properly. I lightly mark the surface so I know where this piece is going to line up, but also it's a guide for where I add my adhesive. Just like before, the adhesive is applied with a small piece of foam and then pressed into place. Going back to my template, I cut out the next piece. This is then lightly marked on the weapon where it's going to go, and then that template is transferred onto some 10mm foam and cut out. Once again, because this is a larger piece, I'm going back to my contact cement. Now, one trick that you can do in a shop is use a heat gun on a low setting, and this will help speed up the cure time. Just to reinforce the very edge of this piece, I do apply a little bit of super glue. I want to start adding some of the detail edges, so in this case I'm using some 10mm HD foam half rounds. These are going to be cut to length and then glued into place using super glue. To close off the gap at the bottom, I'm going to be using a 20mm half round HD foam dowel, and this is also glued into place just with super glue. Before I add the track and teeth to the inside of the weapon, I want to go ahead and knock all these down, so I'm using a medium grit sanding drum, and then after I had taken some chunks out, I go back in with a very smooth sanding drum and round everything over. The internal track on this weapon is a strip of 10mm HD foam. Now, I'm not really trying to be too careful with this because it is an orc weapon, so I'm just kind of eyeballing where I think it should go. Once one side of the weapon had been glued into place, it was very easy just to apply glue to the strip and press it all together. For this weapon, the teeth are also going to be made out of 10mm HD foam. Now, I drew up a whole bunch of these on the template, so I just take each one individually and trace them onto the foam. If you wanted to, you could cut all these out by hand, but the bandsaw makes a quick work of the job. To make it look as though the teeth are running on a track, I added a strip of 2mm HD foam. All the teeth were then cleaned up using a medium grit sanding drum on my rotary tool. To make sure that I had even spacing for all the teeth, I used a cloth ruler and lightly marked where each one needed to go. Before I glued all of them on, I test fit one at the very end just to make sure that the scale and everything is exactly what I wanted. Once I determined it was all good, I glued all the rest into place. Even though it'll never be seen, there are a few teeth that wrap around on the interior, and to get to these sections I used some long-handled tweezers. To make it look as though the handguard is all banded together, I cut some strips of 6mm HD foam and spaced them out accordingly. For the handle, I cut a strip of 2mm HD foam and glue that directly to the cardboard tube. This is to simulate a faux leather wrapped handle. And I finish off the top and the bottom of the handle with a few strips of 6mm foam. I grab a piece of 20mm HD foam round dowel and I cut it at an angle to simulate the hose that goes from the engine to the main body of the weapon. Because the curve of this foam dowel will have a little more resistance to it, I go ahead and use some accelerator along with my super glue. I decided to add a gas line to the side of the weapon just to give it a little bit more detail and character. This is created using a 15mm round dowel for the end of it, and then a 10mm round dowel for the main gas line. Just like the tube on top, I used some super glue and accelerator to keep this dowel in place. To give it the look as though this tube is hastily tacked onto the side of the weapon, I cut a strip of 2mm HD foam to simulate metal clasps. Additional strips of the 2mm were also used to act as detail pieces on the hoses. I made some fake bolt heads by cutting down some 15 and 20mm HD foam round dowels and then detailed these using my rotary tool. I positioned these pretty close to the template, and once I was satisfied with where they were all laid out, I glued them into place with a little bit of super glue. To make some really tiny rivets, I decided to use a leather punch on some 2mm HD foam. Now, these things are so small that I actually put a little daub of glue down on the weapon itself and then used some tweezers to put them in place. Another trick you can do to make it look like rivets are set into the surface is take the end of a ballpoint pen and press it firmly into the foam. On the handguard, I wanted the bolts there to look a little more handmade, so I glued down some sections of 10mm HD foam round dowels. These will be cleaned up with a rotary tool. I bulk up the section above the engine with a piece of 10mm HD foam and then use some additional 6mm foam to look like it's all banded together. When I make props, I really try to take into consideration the fact that it all needs to look as though it belongs there. To detail the very bottom of the handle, I break out my circle jig, cut a couple of pieces, and I glue those into place. Now you'll notice I used a rotary tool here to make it kind of look like it was a hammered metal. To make the spikes for the handguard, I cut sections of 20mm HD foam round dowels and then use my belt sander to get the profile I want. When I glued these onto the handle, I used a little bit of accelerator just because this is a wear and tear part of the weapon. Because this orc weapon can't look pristine, it's time to add some battle damage, and we're going to do that using our rotary tool and a stone bit. Now when it comes to adding battle damage, you could always add way too much. This is one of those steps where it really helps to stop and think about where and why that battle damage is there. The last fabrication step I want to do on this weapon is give the leather on the handle a simulated leather look, and we're going to do that by using our heat gun, heating up the foam, and then pressing tinfoil into it. After it's all said and done, I go in and I do a light heat treatment across the entire surface. Again, you don't want to add too much heat because you could burn or melt the foam. After the light heat treatment is done, I go in with some 400 grit sandpaper and lightly buff the surface so whatever sealant I'm going to use has something to bite into. That's a wrap on part 1 of our Warhammer 40K Ork Choppa series, going over all of the foam fabrication techniques that it took to put this together. Now, I've still got a free template for this available over in the description section, so you guys can download that and build your own. This is still all made out of my HD foam, which you guys can find over at Blick Art Materials. I'll also have links for that over in the description, so you guys can go check that out. Part 2 of this video series is going to go over all of the painting and finishing techniques that it takes to go from a raw weapon to one that's fully rendered. Now, hopefully you guys enjoyed this video and you were able to learn something from it. And until next time, thanks for stopping by.